Welcome to The Property Planet, a podcast with Simon Howley and Amanda Perrotton of Howley Perrotton, the show all about the tax and legal issues surrounding property ownership, where we discuss everything that affects property investors and developers and go deep into the details to unravel the advice, highlight the traps you can fall into and dispel the myths surrounding property ownership in the UK.
Good morning to all of our listeners and welcome to the Property Planet podcast. Thanks for taking the time for choosing to listen to us. Obviously, your support ensures that we can bring the very latest updates and experts. And as always, today's no exception. And we're delighted to have invited, and she has accepted, and come back today, Jane Deeks, who is our in-house VAT expert, with a fascinating background, Jane. So welcome, first of all. And I would like to know how you went from your upbringing to being a trainee VAT advisor at PwC.
Well, hello everybody, and thank you for the invite. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast. I originally come from the fairground. So my parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, going back generations, was all members of what we call the Showman's Guild, which is our regulatory body, and we travelled around the UK with amusement equipment. So you know the things like the waltzers and the dodgems and that sort of thing. So yeah, we'd go to places. We'd be at a place 1 week, maybe another week might be 2 weeks. We actually travelled with an amusement arcade. So I was a dab hand at the Space Invader game. And we also had a bouncy castle. So I had lots of friends because they always wanted to come on the bouncy castle. And if they upset me, I wouldn't let them go on. So I could be a little so-and-so as a child. And then we had a dart stall. And then as I got older, I was managing a gun stall. So that was the Gat guns with the corks. And if I got bored when I was a teenager, I'd be shooting the young gentlemen that walked past now and again and looking the other way. That was always quite fun. But yeah, so I did that, and that was just my normal life. We lived in a caravan, like an old-fashioned big Molly Croft wagon, they was called.
Yeah.
Went to school from the age of 5 to the age of 12, just in the winter months when we settled down, because in those days the fairgrounds always settle down in the winter. They're open a lot more now. There's lots of Christmas markets and fairs and things, but in them days you shut for 2 or 3 months, stayed and sited at what we called as winter quarters, which mine was here at a village near Doncaster. So I've come back to my roots, moving back to Doncaster, and that's when I'd go to school. So from the age of 5 to the age of 12, I probably had about 21 months schooling in total. But I could read and write and I could add up. So from like the age of 5, I used to be sat in the amusement arcade change box handing out change to people. So that kept my numeracy skills good. My mum always used to buy me pens and papers and encouraged me to write to my friends because she said she didn't want me to forget what I'd learnt at school. And then when I was 17, I thought it'd be a good idea to become a solicitor. I'd been reading a book in the library called You and the Law, and it was just a real layman's guide to the law. And I thought, that sounds really interesting. I think I'd like to do that. I don't really want to travel anymore. I'd like to do that. So I asked my parents if they minded if I stayed at the winter quarters and went to college, and they thought it was marvellous and was really encouraging. So they bought me a little touring caravan that I lived in. That was then my home, and off they went travelling. And at 17, I was left on my own to fend for myself financially and everything. And I was advised not to go straight in for GCSEs, and I was advised to do a basic maths and English course. But I took no notice of that because I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do GCSEs. So I took myself off to night school. So I carried on being a traveller for the first year because I went to various different schools, and it's a wonder I got to where, because everyone was at a different place, and I'm surprised I didn't end up at the wrong one night, but I never. And I got through the GCSEs and then went on to do my A-levels at Doncaster College. Then at that point met my husband, and so then when I went to university, I moved to where he lived in Birmingham, went to Birmingham City University to do my law degree. Then Birmingham University to do the legal practice diploma to become a solicitor. And at that point was when PricewaterhouseCoopers came and encouraged all us legally trained people to become tax advisors.
Yeah.
And the money was more, and also I got another qualification, and also it was one of those that once you had PwC on your CV, you was pretty much made then, wasn't you? So
Yeah.
I became a chartered tax advisor instead of a solicitor. But the long plan was eventually I was going to become a tax lawyer. But then children got in the way of that. And then I just was happy with being a chartered tax advisor.
And why not?
That's
pretty
what it
much-
is. Yeah.
Yes.
Why that?
Well, there was a few options of tax on the form I filled in, and it said, and I thought corporation tax sounds interesting, and I know a bit about that. I know there's input tax, output tax, and it's 20%. I thought it sounds a bit boring, but I'll just tick it anyway. And that just happened to get put into the VAT department, and lo and behold, it's not as boring. It's actually really interesting,
Yeah.
and really complicated. So every day I do learn something new. And so yeah, every day is pretty much a challenge, so that's why I enjoy it so much.
Because I think VAT definitely is one of those things that is, most areas of tax are super complicated or unnecessarily complicated, but VAT is in a world of its own, isn't it, in terms of a specialism?
Yeah, I always think that most taxes have a bit of common sense, but I don't think that does. It's just like a
Yeah,
law.
that is strange. Because I started,
Yeah.
I think I started on the IIT exams going back 20 years. This is before it merged with the CTA. But I never really kind of, it was good, but it was just for such a small 105 sections and about what, 8 or 9 schedules as it was then.
Yeah.
Just so complex. Just
Yeah.
absolutely bizarre. But I thought, no, not for me.
So we're obviously exceptionally lucky to have you, so especially as it is so complicated. So in terms of changes, updates, what sort of thing has been going on in terms of sort of budgetary changes? Is there anything that people should be focusing in on, changes that have come through that are going to make a big difference to people?
Yeah, so usually with that and the budget, there's never really much in the budget about VAT. This year, they've increased the VAT registration threshold for the first time in quite a while to £90,000, which is great.
Yeah.
And that's a running 12-month total. So I've recently had a case where a client was badly advised by their accountant who was looking at their 12-month turnover on an annual basis.
Yeah.
And he'd advised them that they hadn't exceeded the threshold when in fact they actually had exceeded it quite a while previously. So yeah, it's a running total. There are 2 types of VAT registrations. There's one what's called a look forward test. So if you knew that you was going to turn over £90,000 in the next 30 days, again, that would make you liable to VAT register. You can also voluntary VAT register, which is what we do with quite a few of our clients here at Howley, where they're intending traders because they're planning on buying property and either converting it, constructing, and in that case, they want to VAT register as soon as possible so that can be recovering the VAT if they're obviously eligible to, and not having to wait, say, 6 months, 12 months till the property's constructed or converted.
So just coming back to that point, and I think that's sort of like quite a crucial point about if they're able to recover. So obviously they register for VAT to buy the property in the first place, and then what are the criteria in which you can recover? And I presume recover on tools and materials, I suppose, that you are buying in order to carry out the development.
Yeah, or if you're paying somebody to build the property or convert the property. So first of all, it's you can only VAT register if you can prove that you're going to be making taxable supplies. And to recover VAT, you've got to be making taxable supplies. So if you bought a residential property with the intention of refurbishing it and then letting it out on as residential lets, then you wouldn't be able to VAT register because the letting of residential accommodation is exempt from VAT. Right. So any VAT you incurred, unfortunately, you wouldn't be able to recover that. So then when you're in a situation like that, we'd look at, well, is it possible, if you're paying a builder to come and do the renovations, is there any reliefs available? Do you have to pay 20% VAT on that conversion cost, or is there anything that can be make that reduced to 5%? And there are in certain situations. So where the property's been empty for a certain length of time, and if you can prove that it's been empty for that certain length of time, then there's something called the empty homes condition. So if you can prove the property's been empty for 2 years prior to you starting the refurbishment, then when you pay a builder, they would only charge you 5%. So that's like a 15% saving. So that's a really useful tool.
Yeah, and I think that probably highlights immediately just the complicated rules about it. And I think with it's reducing. I mean, 5%, that seems sort of quite an arbitrary. Is there any correlation to anything as to why it drops to 5%, or why there's 2 years that it has to be empty for? Is that's just an arbitrary rule from HMRC?
Yeah, well, the 2-year rule is just an arbitrary rule, and the 5% is our reduced rate for VAT, because we've got the 0 rate of VAT, which, although there's no VAT, it's still treated as a taxable supply. And then you've got a 5% rate of VAT, which is the reduced rate that comes in place of various different things. And then you've got your standard rate VAT at 20%. Now, the difference between a 0 rate of supply and an exempt supply. So an exempt supply is where you wouldn't charge VAT. So again, the letting of residential property, there'd be no VAT on that. And then you've got a brand new house, residential house that you've just built and you sell. You can sell that at the 0 rate of VAT, so no VAT again. So both properties are being sold for no VAT, but the difference between the 0 rated sale and the exempt sale is that if you make a 0 rated sale, it's a taxable supply, and therefore you're allowed to VAT register and recover any VAT you've incurred on the construction of that house.
Is there an issue if you were, like, say, developing a property, you claimed the VAT back at whatever rate was applicable, you couldn't sell it, and then therefore you just had to rent it out?
So that's something that happened way back in the early 2000s when the property market crashed. So HMRC allowed a type of concession sort of apportionment. So they knew that a lot of builders was having to rent the properties out because they couldn't sell them. But if it was done on a temporary measure, then they did a type of one-off apportionment calculation, similar to a partial exemption calculation, if anybody's familiar with that, whereby they would have. So what they'd do is say, well, we're going to rent the property out for 12 months because we can't sell it and we need to bring some income in. So HMRC would say, well, let's look at a 10-year period, because that correlates to the capital goods scheme. So they say, so a 10-year period, if you think you're going to sell it in the next 12 months, so you're going to rent it out, then we say that you've got to pay us back 1/10 of the input tax you've recovered, or the VAT on your purchases. You can keep the other 9/10. Yeah. And it's a one-off thing. So you've got to estimate it right, as long as there's no fraudulent reason and you are being, true and honest, then it's just a one-off calculation. And if you ended up renting the property for 2 years, just because you couldn't sell it and you could prove you were still actively trying to sell it, then it wouldn't be an issue. They wouldn't have to go back and make another adjustment. And that was sort of a concession, early, I think 2006-ish.
Yeah, I think it was, yeah. I think was it Barrett Homes or one of the big ones? I think one of the big house builders, I think. Yeah. The case somewhere, from memory anyway. What is partial exemption in simple terms?
So partial exemption is where you've got a business and you're making taxable supplies, so you have to charge VAT on those supplies. And you've also got another income stream where you don't have to charge VAT. So, for instance, you might have somebody who's got a shop and let's say they've got a chip shop, so they make fully taxable supplies via the chip shop, and you have to charge VAT. But that owner of that chip shop's also got a house that he rents out. So he's got a bit of a property rental business going on at the same time. Then he would be, for VAT purposes, everything he does would come under that one VAT registration. So he'd be partial because he's selling fish and chips plus VAT and he's renting out a house that's exempt. So what that means then is you've got to apportion any VAT on your purchases. You've got to, first of all, directly attribute them. What relates to the sale of the fish and chips? So anything that's directly attributable to the running of the fish and chip shop can be recovered because that relates to making of taxable supplies. Anything that directly relates to the rental of the property, so any renovations, any repairs, estate agency fees, that's directly attributable to exempt supplies, so you can't recover that. And then anything that relates to the business in general and can't be directly attributed to either income stream, so your general overheads, so your accountancy fee, your tax advisors fees, things like that, are then put into what we call the pot, or they're treated as residual input tax. So then by using a calculation by calculating your taxable divided by your total, timesing it by 100, you get a percentage that says this is how much you can recover out of that pot. So you can recover all the VAT that relates to the fish and chip shop and a percentage of your general overheads, and then nothing from the exempt. That's basically the basic. Is that basic enough?
That's as clear as mud.
No, I tell you what, that just exemplifies how complicated it is.
I'm sorry, I asked the question now.
Yeah, sorry. And then the other thing is, then if you fall under, there's a de minimis limit. So if all your exempt income, so that is part of the pot that you can't recover, the exempt input tax that relates to the residential property, if you add those together and they fall below a certain de minimis limit, which is £7,500 a year, and that exempt input tax is not more than 50% of total input tax, so there's two criteria to it, then you can be treated as fully taxable, which means you've done all those calculations for nothing and you can recover all your VAT.
Okay. Great.
But you have to do the partial exemption calculations on a quarterly basis, and then you do an annual adjustment at the end of the year. So you might have a situation where one quarter you can't recover some VAT, another quarter you're below the de minimis limits and you can recover everything, and then you can't. But then your overall partial exemption annual calculation might show that either you're below the de minimis and you can recover VAT back from HMRC, or the VAT you did recover on the couple of quarters might have to be repaid to HMRC.
Okay. So I suppose in a nutshell, but if you've got a building and say on the bottom floor is a fish and chip shop and on the top floor or 2 or 3 floors is residential letting, then from that one building, you've got a mixed supply basically. Yeah,
you could have. So if you're just the landlord of that one building, if you've opted to tax the building, it will only apply to the commercial part of the building, because options to tax don't apply to residential accommodation. And then it'd be the same thing. So you would be making taxable and exempt supplies. But
so a lot of apply to say if a guy had a chip shop in say Doncaster and he's got 7 flats in Leeds, they wouldn't be affected, would they? The partial exemption, because it's just a separate thing, isn't it?
It depends if he's still the same. If he's got those under his own as a partnership, or if it's in the same legal entity, the ownership.
So we're the same business.
Yeah.
So partnership okay, I get you now.
Or limited company.
I understand now. Yeah.
And that is something that a lot of people make a mistake with. They don't realise. They think, I've got separate businesses. That one's VAT registered. This one isn't.
But it's all the same pot.
You've got to look at the legal entity, Right.
So if you had a separate company for the chip shop.
That's exciting, isn't it?
Right, okay, I'm clear now. That's much clearer now. I was thinking, hang on a minute. Yeah, okay.
So people listen. Actually, it would be what they'd be well advised to put them into different subsidiaries, so you can have the different subsidiaries. So you could have the 7 flats in Leeds under a different subsidiary company or a different subsidiary to your chip shop. That would actually make it far easier, wouldn't it?
Yes, you get trading and investments in a separate company.
Yeah.
So it's not mixed.
Yeah, or if it was just both property, so if we're just renting out the fish and chip shop, then, because obviously, like you say, it's better to keep your trade and your property in separate companies for risk purposes. But if it is just the property, it might be better that you're partially exempt, because you'd be able to at least recover some of your professional fees and costs and the general overheads. You might be able to recover a bit.
Yeah.
What's the VAT ruling generally on claiming back VAT or your input tax on professional fees like restructuring fees, or if you're kind of forming a group or whatever? Is there some kind of restriction on that?
Not if you're making taxable supplies, but if there's a holding company involved, then there's special rules, and you need to make sure that there are the conditions are met, so that holding company is making some kind of taxable supplies. There's been a recent case that's just been appealed. It was won at tribunal and everything up on its head. So HMRC have appealed it, and I do believe it's gone back to appeal in the last few days, called the Hotel Latour case.
Okay.
So that was about that hotel company had a company with a hotel in it in Milton Keynes. And they sold that company, which is an exempt share sale, which means you can't recover your professional fees because you've made an exempt sale of shares. But the whole reason they sold that company was because they was building another one of their hotels in a different area. So
Okay.
they did it for the purpose. So the judge held that actually there is a taxable purpose behind this. Now that's totally different to all the other case law. So it is, at the time, it put everybody in a position to say, well, look, we can go back 4 years now, look at the professional fees. Have we got any circumstances like this? And if you have, then there's a potential to put in a claim. And if you're running out of time, I'd still advise you can put a claim in for that unrecovered VAT now, and you just stand it behind the Hotel de Tour case. If you're not running out of time, then you're probably better off just sitting and waiting, see what happens.
See what happens. Okay.
Yeah. And then there's also been some case law this year, interesting case law, the Sonder case, which is to do with the tour operators margin scheme and serviced accommodation. So HMRC don't like the idea that service accommodating businesses can use the tour operators margin scheme, because obviously then they're paying HMRC a lot less VAT. But it's a good scheme to use because obviously it's hard to charge VAT on top of serviced accommodation. Most people expect there not to be any VAT. And if you would fall under the tour operators margin scheme, you wouldn't charge your customers VAT, and you'd only account for VAT on your profit margin.
Yeah.
And you can't recover any VAT on your purchases if you're using TARMS. But usually when people are buying in residential accommodation with no VAT, and then they're making an onward supply of that accommodation that's similar to a hotel that could be taxable. So it's a really good scheme that could be used. But again, HMRC have appealed that case as well. So we're just waiting and seeing at the moment what comes back in regards to that one.
Okay, so Tom's is quite similar to the second-hand goods scheme. Like when you're selling cars, I used to do a car dealership years ago, just working a VAT on the profits. I mean, that's about 20 years, probably 25
look like
years.
a dodgy car dealer, Simon.
Well, it was Yorkshire. You've got to start somewhere in tax, haven't you?
I had a car dealer client once, actually. But yeah, it is similar. But the whole purpose of the TOMS scheme was to stop tour operators having to VAT register all around Europe. But the way and it's complex legislation, and the way it was written, it resulted in anybody could fall into TOMS. You don't have to be a tour operator. You can just say, right, oh, you want me to book you a ticket for an event? Oh, and you would like me to get you a hotel, and you want a taxi? That all falls into TOMS. So it was all a bit funny. I think it's all going to change at some point, because since we left the EU, when we make supplies now that fall into Europe, they're treated as zero rated, where before they were standard rated. And then supplies made by companies that was in the EU, made them into the UK, they would have been standard rated in their countries. But now neither countries, especially the EU, aren't happy because they're losing a lot of VAT from it.
Yeah.
So I think it'll change at some point, but they've not done anything yet. But so if people can use that when if this Sonder case comes back in the positive, then that's a really good thing for any of the clients that are letting serviced accommodation.
Is there ever? I mean, there's always scope, obviously, for HMRC to make it retrospective. But is that something that you're familiar with in the VAT world, or is that so if somebody took advantage of it now, they can do so thinking chances are they won't. Yeah,
like
they won't make
the VAT world, the hobbits.
They won't make it retrospective. Because often, sort of, we found, certainly with, like, in the old days with like SDLT things, schemes, they made those retrospective, and
or even quite rare at the time. That was
that
was quite rare at the time to do that, because obviously
because they've done it with obviously the loan charge schemes. That's sort of what crippled people as well.
That went back then to 20 years, but I think they restricted it now. I think back to obviously 2010, I think it was, when they brought out the real changes to legislation. In December of 20.
I think the difference with this is the case went to tribunal, in a first tier tribunal, and the first tier judge agreed that under those particular circumstances that fell within TOMS.
Right.
So if it goes back to the court and the court says that it doesn't fall into TOMS, then I guess HMRC can go back and assess people going back 4 years who have been using it. If the court says, well, actually, no, we agree with the first tier, then if HMRC didn't appeal, then people could put claims in and go back and say, well, actually, we either shouldn't have been VAT registered or we paid too much VAT. Because the other thing with the TOMs that's really good is you only look at your profit margin to determine your VAT registration.
Yeah.
Threshold.
Okay. So it's not turnover, it's profit margin.
But that's the only time that's ever the situation with TOMs. So a lot of the serviced accommodation suppliers might not even have to be VAT registered if TOMs applied.
Right. Okay.
But would HMRC then deny any reclaims back if it's undue enrichment? Is that what it's called? Where you can, in effect, you kind of...
Yeah, I mean, potentially, but in that market, there's only a certain ceiling that you can charge for the rent, isn't there, and the accommodation, and it's a very competitive market. So yeah. I would argue there is no unjust enrichment. We've charged the maximum that we possibly could, regardless of whether we was VAT registered or not, and therefore it's just a VAT inclusive amount.
Shall we just define what undue enrichment actually means to our listeners?
Go on, man. You brought it up. I'll let you.
Yeah,
do
I
that.
know about it. I can't remember what it is.
Well, it's basically
from my studies.
Taking a benefit over and above what you should have had in the first place, effectively.
Yeah. I think it is what it is. I think it's just a common sense explanation what it is. Yeah, it's not a technical term, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel that that is an area as well that wouldn't necessarily trigger somebody to think, I should be doing this or I should be doing that. So how would people listening think, I need to take advice? What sort of triggers should they be looking at? So obviously sort of classic listeners are landlords or developers, or so I think it'd be really helpful just to have the trigger points at which somebody says, oh, I really need to speak to somebody about the VAT position on this.
Yeah. I mean, I think the first and the easiest one is keep an eye on your rolling 12 months turnover.
Yeah.
And look at all your turnover from everything that falls under the particular legal entity that the business has operated.
Yeah.
And maybe seek advice, because it could be that, like you say, you're not actually exceeding the VAT threshold because you might fall under some different scheme, or it might be that you're partially exempt. The other would be, because VAT's based on transactional basis, if you're planning on going to buy a property or sell a property, then that's something that you ought to be looking at advice for, because there's a big transaction and there's always going to be a lot of money involved. There are instances, depending on what you plan to do with a property, where if it's commercial property and somebody wants to charge you VAT, then they would have had to have opted to tax. So that's where they notify HMRC that they want to charge VAT on the property sale. Sounds a bit strange. Why would somebody want to do that? But the whole reason behind that is back to the taxable supply issue. And can I recover the VAT on my purchases? And that's why then they would want to make a taxable supply to be able to recover their VAT. In some instances, that option to tax might have been made a long time ago. It might not be that material to the seller when it comes to selling. And we could then potentially get that option to tax disapplied because of what the purchaser's doing. So if the purchaser is intending to convert a commercial property into residential, then it's possible to disapply that option to tax. That you need careful consideration on the basis that you're declaring what you're going to do, and if anything went wrong, it's you that would be liable for the VAT that the seller didn't charge. But that's a really useful tool and can result in a very good cash flow saving. And depending on the value of the property, it can also result in quite a good stamp duty land tax saving. So because the stamp duty land tax is charged on the VAT inclusive value. So if you remove your stamp duty level. And I find a lot of times in these types of transactions, my fees are usually covered by the savings with the stamp duty tax. Yeah. Plus people still earn a little bit. So it's definitely worth getting it correct. But definitely big high value transactions. And if you was buying a business as well, if, for instance, you decided you wanted to buy a property, but you was buying it in a limited company, then you take over the liability of that company and the VAT liability. So you would highly recommend we had a VAT due diligence where we looked into the VAT and whether it's been accounted for correctly or not before you purchased the limited company.
Yeah, because that is very, very well. It's much more popular, obviously, if you buy the shares in a company rather than buying the property itself. So that's, I think, quite a notable ripple effect with regards to the VAT point and taking on the liabilities of the company. I think I think sometimes that clients become tunnel vision about saving a particular tax, maybe in this case like SDLT, and don't think of the wider issues of actually taking on the debts of the company. So I think actually to think about having a VAT audit effectively would be.
Well, it's more than that, isn't it? Because you need, and if you buy the shares, you take on the history as well on all the liabilities.
Yeah.
So if there's anything in there,
For all the taxes,
a tax avoidance scheme done 5 years ago, that fails, whatever, it's a company, therefore that liability is to do, VAT issues, pay as you earn. So yeah, it's important to get get it all checked out before you do that.
Yeah.
Right.
And also if you're buying a business, so if some people might not even see it as a business, if you decide to buy a property that's already let, then that might be a transfer of a going concern, and there might be no VAT on that property, even though it's a commercial property that's opted and they're charging VAT on the rent. But provided certain conditions are met, then it could be regarded as a TOGC, and again you've got that cash flow and stamp duty land tax saving.
Isn't a TOGC, that's if you've met the criteria, it's applied, I think, is it automatic? You'd have to claim it, do you?
No, it's basically, is the VAT liability correct or not? So is the VAT liability standard rated, or does the supply fall under the transfer of going concern conditions? If those conditions are met, then it's outside the scope of VAT. But you
remember all these things from my studies. It's all there, you see. It's just trapped away.
I just think it's a bit of a minefield for business people to navigate through, really.
Yeah, it is. It's crazy, isn't it? How much they've got to try and. I mean, I rely on my accountant and my direct tax people for my help with that.
But I mean, I think the thing is, you don't know what you don't know. So it's so nuanced with all the rules and regulations that I don't know. Asking the right question sometimes is as hard as getting the right advice.
Absolutely. That's when a client comes to me and wants a fee quote for advice. Half the time, by the time we've finished having a quick meeting and a chat about what they need and what they want, their question they originally asked is only like maybe that part of it, and then there's actually, well, what about this and what about that, and then there's the other, and then they're like, all right. So then I end up telling them, actually, this is the advice you need, these are the questions we need to answer, because they don't know, they're not expected to.
So I think crucially, get some preliminary advice at the start so that you actually know what questions to ask.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm always happy to have a chat with anybody for them to find, a free, no obligation chat, just to find out, actually, have you got a VAT issue? So I did have a call with a gentleman the other day, and he's deciding, there's 2 different properties and they're trying to decide which one they want to buy. And he just asked me a few questions, and I said, well, this is what you need to know. It seems like the same advice is required for both properties because there's a similar situation. But come back to me once you've exchanged contracts, or you're at the point of exchanging contracts, so that we make sure we can put something in place. Because I think if we do it all correctly, you will be able to get it without VAT under the TOGC rules. And that was even a property that his business was occupying for that business's purpose. And then the other building was a building that had a tenant in, and they would buy and then use part of it, but continue renting.
Complex
planning that can be put in place to help with the transfer of a going concern situation.
So get advice to start with, I think.
And I've been living VAT and dreaming about VAT for the past over 25 years now. I used to talk about it in my sleep, apparently. The kids know all about it, because when I was younger and I used to do presentations, I used to make them sit there while I did my presentation in front of them. And they used to go, I know that it's the reduced rate on conversions, on empty homes, ma'am, and conversions, you get the reduced rate.
Oh, brilliant.
Bless
Oh, I
him.
think that's brilliant. Well, thanks ever so much for your time. As always, it's been a real pleasure talking to you and hearing your vast knowledge sort of hopefully, well, certainly makes me, and I'm sure everybody listening, think need to speak to you first. So thanks very much for coming on, Jane, and we look forward to talking to you again sometime.
Okay, yeah, that's
Thanks,
lovely.
Jane.
Thank you both.
Fab.
Thank you.
Cheerio.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening, and tune in next time when we discuss more of the tax and legal issues surrounding your business and property needs.